Thank you for joining us, and welcome to our webinar, Supply Chain Control Tower, Concept and Impact, hosted by Aberdeen Group and sponsored by Kinaxis. My name is Joe Venezia, and I'll be your moderator. Our speakers for today's webinar are Bryan Ball, Vice President and Principal Analyst of the Supply Chain Management Research Practice here at Aberdeen Group, and Kirk Munroe, Vice President of Marketing at Kinaxis. If you'd like to read their speaker bios, please click on the Speaker Bio button on your screen. You'll also notice a Presentation Asset tab below that, which includes related content assets if you're interested. And if you'd like to submit a question for our Q&A session at the end of today's webinar, please click on the Ask a Question tab, type your question in the field provided, and click the Ask a Question button below. A copy of the slides will be emailed to all the attendees in a follow-up email. And it's now my pleasure to turn the webinar over to Bryan Ball. Bryan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joe. So today we're going to talk about Supply Chain Control Towers, Concept and Impact. And let me quickly take you to our agenda for the day. I'm going to briefly give you a little introduction to Aberdeen and the methodology behind our research. Then talk about the Control Tower business case. Then go through our PACE methodology, which is the pressures, actions, capabilities, and what we call the power of the tower, which is the measurement side, looking at what the metrics are. The technology enablers, and then a brief wrap-up and summary. And then Kirk Munroe from Kinaxis will be presenting some slides, and then we'll take Q&A after that. So jumping into Aberdeen in terms of our supply chain practice, we cover both the planning and the execution side. Sort of that seems to be the division, the way most people have it divided up. Bob Haney handles mostly the execution, which is the distribution, warehouse management, logistics. I handle the planning, S&OP, B2B collaboration, demand planning, etc. We cross over at the point of visibility, but we pretty much cover the beginning end, soup to nuts on the supply chain end of it. So a little bit about our community. We have over 4,100 executives that we survey in the past year, over 450 published reports, 27,000 report downloads yearly, and 75,000 subscribers. So we've got a fairly rich community that we tap for our surveys. And to follow from that, I'll give you a little bit about our methodology in terms of how Aberdeen approaches it. When we talk about our survey respondents, we categorize them into what we call best-in-class, industry average, and laggards. The best-in-class are defined as the top 20% based on key business metrics. Typically, in supply chain, we normally look at things like gross margin, customer service, inventory turns, cash-to-cash cycle, or a combination of them. But typically, the best-in-class are generally ahead in virtually all of them, regardless of which ones we pick. The industry average is the middle 50, and again, the laggard is the bottom 30. So let's see how that then leads into what we do with our research. We take a look at those companies, and we study the best-in-class and say, what are the pressures facing these businesses? Then we look at what they are doing to offset these pressures strategically through their actions. In other words, what are they actually doing to counteract what they feel the business pressure on? And then, what success are they having? What are they not doing? Where is it working? Where is it not working? And we can look at that via the metrics. And then also, what are the technologies and services that enable those capabilities to make those actions happen? So that's fundamentally the PACE methodology. And we employ that in our research and in our findings. Today, when we look at the control tower, before I jump into the business case, we actually deviated a little bit, but from the best-in-class view, and we took a look at those with control tower capabilities and those without control tower capabilities. But then we still applied the PACE methodology to it and said, well, gee, how are those with the capabilities responding, and what do their metrics look like compared to those without? And so the methodology is still applied, but the slice of the data is just a little bit different. So let's take a look at the business case and define that. And we talk about the business challenge for control towers. Being a practitioner in supply chain, the question is always, what if we could remove all the delay in information, operate in real time, get our decisions real time? What could we do? And we could respond to customer inquiries almost on the spot. What if questions could be answered in minutes and not hours and days? We wouldn't keep the customer waiting, or we wouldn't hold up the decision. And any delay in those decisions, time equals money, as many of us have heard, and in many cases, certainly in supply chain, time equals inventory. So that's another way of looking at that. And so then the question is the notion of real-time visibility and actionable insight, is it really feasible? Can that actually happen? Is there such a system that exists, or is there a capability out there that allows that to occur? And so the sort of the holy grail, if you would be, is to take as much of that latency out of the process. It's always been what supply chain leaders try to do. How do I shrink down the process time, the decision time? How do I reduce the assets employed? And once I get it down to the next level, then can I shrink it some more? So there's this perpetual cycle of trying to get it as tight as you can and as small as you can from the standpoint of maximizing return on investment, or the most bang for the buck, so to speak. And so the promise of control towers is that if we can ever really achieve this real-time view and this end-to-end view of the supply chain, it has the potential to make this possibility come alive, or get as close to it as what is really practical or feasible. So with that, let's take a look again at how we define it. Loosely defined, if you want to take a look at it from the standpoint of what you hear in conferences and other papers, a control tower is a concept. It's a solution spanning the supply chain, creating an end-to-end seamless and holistic view. And this is beyond the four walls. It's really across the supply chain network, be it the customer, the enterprise, and the supporting cast in terms of networks, suppliers, partners, logistics providers. And so we really look at it as the end-to-end view. Alerts are provided or would be provided in real time, and the problem can be solved from anywhere in that particular view, from anywhere in the supply chain. And at that point, wherever you are able to see that problem or alert, you can resolve the problem from that point. Data and information is available, and those that need to be contacted are it shows up in that alert view. So again, that's the concept. The latency in the process and the data delay is substantially reduced, and you get as close to real time or near real time as you possibly can get. So the challenge then, from a research perspective, is there's not many organizations out there that today would say, gee, I have a control tower, and it's not the most common thing that you would run into. So we took a look in terms of being able to quantify or measure or talk about control towers. We said, let's take a look at it from the concept of defining control towers for our purposes in terms of their capabilities. What has to be in place, and then let's try to come up with a measurement to see if that concept improves the situation or worsens it. So what we did was we said, first of all, you have to have a centralized view as a beginning point, and then we said that you have to have the drill down and problem resolution capability to solve that problem. Okay, regardless of how you have that capability, we just said however you define the ability to drill down, let's test those capabilities and then see and call that control tower-like capabilities, and those without it, we call those companies, they do not have control tower capabilities. And from that definition, we then took a look at the metrics, and we chose the time to problem resolution as the key metric that we wanted to isolate and say, if this concept really works and it improves the situation, we should see substantial reduction in time to problem resolution. And then let's also look at the other metrics that are involved in measuring organizations and see if we don't get superior performance there as well. So before we dive into all the metrics and the data, let's take a look back to our PACE methodology of what are the pressures that these companies are feeling in terms of running their business. And in terms of this particular survey, It was a business-to-business collaboration type survey that we chose, so we would expect people to be responding with that thought in mind. And the first thing we see is the need to improve top-line revenue, and greater than 50%, slightly over. But when we say grow, it really means grow profitably. And I'll talk in a moment just about what we mean by growth, what that might entail. The second thing is the complexity of global operations. It sounds like a great buzzword, but if you peel back that onion a layer or two, it very quickly talks about expanding the customer base or the supply base of companies that have extended their supplier base over to China or other countries. Doesn't have to be China, but as an example, or they are using third-party logistics providers, anything that extends the network beyond sort of the four walls and immediate control, anything that really adds more nodes or adds more lead time or potentially adds that kind of lead time. And then escalating demand for service from customers. It comes in a lot of forms. It sounds like maybe just better service level might be the first thought, but again, that could be in terms of support. It could be in terms of on the marketing side, or it could be engineering. It could be field support. So it could come in many forms. And then if you took a look at all three of those, it's no surprise that the last one is diminishing control over supply chain operating costs. It just means that there are more and more factors influencing costs that, and if you take a look at the first three we just mentioned, all of those are cost bucket contributors in one form or another. So let me now take you to sort of what's behind those pressures. In growth, in terms of managing profitability, we talked about capacity, capital, systems, and controls. So when we say pressure, this is what companies are really meaning. How do I do that? And if I can get the most out of my capacity, then I don't have to add another factory or another distribution center. I can get more for my money, if you will, out of existing facilities. So streamlining processes are always key things, trying to take cost out and minimize that capacity utilization. Capital, meaning what will I have to deploy to continue to grow? Could it be machines? Could it be systems? Could it be, people in other locations? What are the things that I've got to do to actually, make that growth happen? And then also just the controls. As I expand, how am I going to be able to do this and have great interoperability between locations, facilities, if you will? And add to that the complexity side, additions of suppliers, partners, networks, geos. Fundamentally, as you add nodes, it's very difficult, if you will. Lead time tends to increase with the extension of the supply chain. And so if you just took a look at just adding any nodes at all, and yet still being taxed with maintain current customer service levels or improve them, and then maintain cost or improve them, it's a real challenge because it means I've actually got to take into account all these additional nodes and level of complexity, not lose any ground, and then try to also make up ground on top of that. So the service level is a real challenge in that kind of environment. And then there's the demand for service, as we talked a little bit, value added, design, marketing, advertising. It could also be installation, field support, anything that might constitute value-added service to the customer that might differentiate the organization from between themselves and, let's say, a competitor. So any of those things apply, but there's always a belief that with those value-added services that you might provide or demand for services that you fulfill, there's a back-end reward, possibly more growth, more volume, but there's no guarantee in that. The point is that all of them tend to be cost buckets until they turn into that sort of back-end reward, if you will. And then you sum those up, and really that's where you get to the diminishing control over supply chain costs being a real pressure that companies are trying to endure. And then the speed of decision just amplifies that cost challenge. In other words, things are not slowing down; they're getting faster. And again, we'll talk about some of that as we work through the presentation. So now let's take a look at the actions that companies are deploying to sort of address those pressures. Those with control tower and without control tower capabilities, not a tremendous amount of difference In terms of streamlining processes, again, that's how you manage the growth. You try to get more out of what your existing facilities can give you or your existing systems can offer. And not a lot of difference in terms of starting collaboration with suppliers. Again, this was a B2B survey, so I would expect most respondents to be pretty equal on that. Where you do see a difference or a gap between control tower-like companies and those without is in the multiple scenarios to analyze the sales and operations plan, or if you will, the plan of record. There's a tremendous gap, double-digit, 20 points between, the two, 44 to 24%, where the control tower companies are much more likely to be running multiple scenarios, which is sort of one of the benefits. From those particular views that I mentioned that they could resolve the problem, they want to really test that out, vet the plans, understand the trade-offs, and I'll take a look at a little more depth on that. It's enabled by the CT capabilities. When we get to the capabilities, it'll be a little more clear how they get to those multiple scenarios. But they view the challenge by testing the limits. And when you're talking about an S&OP, what breeds the buy-in is it's not just one plan and everybody says, yep, looks good. It's much more about show me the things that you checked or that you modeled so I understand, what the limits of our view, are, so I can understand that we vetted all the options, I looked at all the trade-offs. And so when people see that those trade-offs were addressed and considered and a plan is settled upon, there's a lot more confidence in that plan that we've got what we need and we've considered all the variabilities that might occur. And by looking at those variabilities up front, when a crisis occurs or an unplanned event occurs, the organization is much more likely to respond in the appropriate direction. So vetting all those things and looking at all those scenarios is a very key point, and it breeds a commitment at all levels, and confidence before you begin to execute. And the other thing that happens is it's an end-to-end view. It's not just within the four walls. If you're looking at it from a control tower perspective, you're getting that end-to-end view, considering the customer, considering suppliers. So the concept, again, is much broader than what most companies traditionally consider when they're really looking at an S&OP plan. So now let's move forward to the capabilities and talk about both the process and the organization capabilities, and this is where you see the gap. Notice before we had a gap in the one action, which is the multiple scenarios. Now when we look at control tower capabilities versus non-control tower, we see quite a differential in terms of some of these critical processes. One of them is managing relationships on an end-to-end basis. It almost says that those without capabilities really haven't even thought about the prospect. They're less than 10%, versus those with control tower, more than half are likely to be able to have that capability in terms of the people and the processes available to do that. And that's up and down the entire supply chain. Then you look at also managing multiple scenarios, operation scenarios, creating those. We just talked about that in terms of actions. This is the capability side. It really says that on the capability side, 41% are likely to have that. And again, the non-control tower companies aren't really even in the game. They may attempt it, but they don't really have the tools in place, if you will. And then looking at it holistically, this is much more the organizational side and a bit of a chicken and the egg kind of discussion. Do people look at the supply chain holistically because they have the tools, or did they have that view and then, moved towards the tool to sort of support their ability and their vision of an end-to-end supply chain, that you could view holistically? So not trying to answer that question immediately because I think it's organizational dependent, but the point is in either case they're moving in the right direction. And again, there's a more than 3-to-1 likelihood that the control tower companies are have those things in place. And then one that we picked up on, which could help on the financial side, is they're much more likely to have a profit-optimized supply-demand match. They would have considered that in terms of doing the supply-demand match. They've already thought about those things up front. So again, a lot richer capabilities than those that have control tower capabilities versus those that don't. So let's sort of recap that a little bit. There was a lot to digest. First is managing relationships end to end, making it happen with confidence, multiple scenarios, command of the data, options and the timing, end-to-end perspective, understanding the cross-functional trade-offs very quickly. Again, back to the actions, not guessing and hoping. I mean, you've got confidence because you've done the plan initially, and then you've got confidence in the plan prior to execution. Holistic view, and then again, the profit optimized. So now let's take a look at the benefits, and this is where you want to see, based on the concept, do we really get improvement? Do we really get bang for the buck when we talk about control towers and what they would enable? So let's now dive in. And the one thing we found, and again, the key measurement we went after is, what happens to time to problem resolution. And not surprisingly, we found that, the control tower capabilities, those companies cut the problem resolution time from roughly 10 days to 6 days in our immediate survey, but that's fundamentally a 40% improvement. I mean, that is huge. So if you could take 40% in theory out of your entire supply chain, let's just say that you applied it across the whole thing and you could reduce it by 40%, that would translate into substantial, call it inventory reduction, improvement in decision-making, timeliness for decision-making to partners and suppliers, and more responsiveness to the customer. Anything you want to talk about in terms of time would improve along the supply chain and the corresponding metrics to go along with it. So, we did find this significant reduction. What we hope to find correspondingly is we looked specifically at the cash-to-cash cycle. It didn't equate, 100% in terms of a 40% improvement, but we did find, again, a substantial reduction of 7 days out of the 56, which is fundamentally 12.5%, 13% in terms of cash-to-cash cycle gain. And again, this is for those that have the capabilities in place compared to those that don't. And it could mean that they haven't reaped all the benefits yet, but and they're still moving in that direction, but very clearly a significant reduction. This is not a 1 or 2 point, slightly incremental improvement. This is really, substantial improvement, and I think one that anyone would like to have. So now we look at, if you will, some of the other metrics in terms of how they perform and deliver. If you remember, I said the key one we wanted to look at was the problem resolution time, and we went immediately after the cash-to-cash cycle as an obvious benefit in terms of a time reduction. But surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, what we also found in terms of process improvement, we looked at forecast accuracy at the product group level and at the SKU level. And again, those with capabilities, really almost a 50% advantage over those without in terms of forecast accuracy, much better. And you can only equate that to the fact that they're looking at the end-to-end supply chain holistically, collaborating with customers, vetting all the questions, probably going back to their customers, and they're certainly looking at the data in detail and responding to that and testing the scenarios. So they're much more apt to be on top of changes and accuracy improvements than those without those capabilities. So they're completely on top of their business in terms of the process side. And the other thing you would hope to see would be, customer service. And again, those sort of the three, key buckets. You're looking at cost, you're looking at inventory, and you're looking at service when you're talking to supply chain experts. And the service end, again, from the mid-90s, 94% down to 89, doesn't sound like a lot, but again, this is across all companies. But I can tell you that having been in the consumer goods business, that you were really talking, if you weren't at 98% when you're dealing with a Lowe's, a Walmart, or a Home Depot, you really couldn't get to the next discussion. So a 1 point improvement is a huge, challenge trying to move customer service. Anybody that's ever attempted that, those numbers stay at a particular level for a reason. So a 5 point gap in service from the 90s down in somewhere into the 80s is a big difference when you're talking customer service. I know in any of the make-to-stock kind of businesses, gaining a point is a big deal. Again, this may include those that are make-to-order, so those are factored in as well, and it may not be quite as critical, but certainly customer service on time and exact shipments with no errors are kind of the measure. And anybody that has a credibility issue with their customer ultimately probably pays the price and loses some orders to the competition. So again, a big deal in terms of those with control tower capabilities and those without on the process side and on the other metric side of customer service. So across the board, we find that control towers deliver, and without any exception, looking at basically all the metrics we want to take a look at. So just recapping in terms of what we said on the metrics: 40% less time to problem resolution, reduced latency, lowers the cash-to-cash cycle by taking inventory out fundamentally, and then better metrics across the board for the forecast accuracy and then also the customer service. So moving to the enablers, and I think this is a key point of the discussion, that if you've been following along, what is it that is in place or what does it take to get to a control tower? And it's an interesting discussion because of the way that we looked at the data. We've said basically we have to look at all the enablers that those with control tower capabilities have. So we can't really exclude anything. It doesn't say that each one of these are equally important. It just says that all of these technology enablers were involved in the control tower companies versus those without. But before you dive into the specifics of them, I would suggest just look at the gaps between the two. And what it tells you is that those with control tower capabilities have a much higher propensity for technology adoption than those without. And I just look at the comparisons: 83 to 58, 52 to 13, 36 to 30, 55 to 29, and so forth. And, if you're less than 10%, if you're down around in the 10% range, you're really not even, you don't even have your toe in the water, or you barely have your toe in the water. And some of these are greater than 50% more likely, control tower to non-control tower. So what jumps off the page at me is just the technology uptake or adoption by control tower companies compared to those without. Now, specifically looking at those particular measures, you've got, business analytics in there. You've got, if you will, end-to-end planning or planning optimization. You've got ERP tools in there. So there's probably a system of record for everybody. That's most likely the case. They all tend to use it, not so far apart on consulting services. Having advanced tools in terms of planning is probably a big deal in terms of running scenarios quickly. But it's the sum of these tools that makes the difference. And the next point I would make is the closer you can get to one system or one solution that has all of these capabilities in them, the better off you are, because anytime you've got multiple systems as your enablers, you're doing a handoff at some level, either in terms of a data model, there's an integration point, is there a time delay, anything that causes a delay or there's an update, that's one more step in the latency process. So the closer you can get to sort of one view of the supply chain for your control tower, the better off you're going to be. And that's really the takeaway here when you're talking about the enablers is really understanding that they have a much greater adoption. And the second thing is it's really the sum of all parts. So when I get to sort of the summary of that, you've got to assume that at least at some level, all those pieces might be used. Again, probably not in equal measure. Okay, there's some alert capability. There's some system of record capability, as I indicated. There's some what-if scenario planning capability. And I talked about the adoption 2 or 3 times, but the critical point is that the closer to one solution delivering these capabilities, the fewer the handoffs, integration points, data models, and process delays, and therefore you get that further reduction in latency that you're really looking for when you want to create this end-to-end holistic view across your entire supply chain. So now let's just quickly maybe summarize from the standpoint of, what the takeaways are that we want to emphasize and looking at control towers and their benefits and the definition and where we might go from here looking forward. I think in terms of a definition, it's going to continue to evolve. Not to belabor the point, but we took a stab at it. We put a stake in the ground and said, let's at least start with a common view or centralized view, if you will, and then also the ability to drill down and solve root cause problems, get to the root cause and solve the problem, as sort of the stake in the ground that we want to measure from in terms of capabilities of those with and those without. And then we also wanted to look at, what are the metrics around those kind of companies versus those without. And regardless of the ultimate definition, where it ends up, if it becomes something that's cast in stone down the road, it really, the key capabilities and the focal point is the ability to determine the impact of an event, whatever that event might be and wherever that event might be. It also is a function of who needs to know about it and who needs to be included and, what's the team of folks that need to be brought together to be able to get there. So it's not only in terms of the outcome, it's also in the solution. Who's got to be included? For example, if it's a supplier delay, I probably have to get the buyer involved. I might have to get the supplier involved in a collaborative discussion. It could be that if it's an unplanned or unforeseen demand that comes in, it might be a discussion with the customer, certainly with the planner, possibly a supplier as a result of maybe something way beyond what our normal capabilities might handle. Could be manufacturing as well. So understanding the nature of the problem and who's got to be contacted is a real key step here. And being able to do that is sort of an inherent or implied capability that's got to be there if when you get to this ultimate definition. So from our definition, we do know that it's a centralized view with the root cause drill down capability, as we've said. Control tower companies are 3 times more likely to have personnel that view their supply chains holistically as linked processes. And I can't emphasize the people side and the silo elimination side of it. It's the getting away from the silos, looking across, viewing it end to end, and understanding that's how the business works. It's a very much of a horizontal view of the world instead of a vertical view. And where some companies may be integrated, they still think as from their perspective within their silo. They don't think of it as an end-to-end capability, if you will. They've got a substantial savings in time to problem resolution. We documented that as a key finding, and we're no surprise really when you think about it is if this is going to work and we have those capabilities, it shows up. It's very clear. This is not like a 1 or 2%. 40%, you could argue it could be off a little one way or the other, but that's a big number in terms of taking latency out of the supply chain in terms of processes or decision making, if you will. And then the cash-to-cash cycle, the resultant metric, as well as the other metrics that we discussed, across the board, a control tower-like company, substantially improves, on all the metrics, customer service, process-wise in terms of forecast accuracy, and then on the financial side in terms of inventory reduction or cash-to-cash cycle. So that really concludes the prepared discussion that I wanted to present on control towers, and would like to turn the meeting over to Kirk Munroe from Kinaxis for his comments, and then we'll take the Q&A or questions and respond to your questions after the fact. Kirk, go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Bryan, and I think you summarized and had the data to back up the case really well. As I lead into my part, I'd like to quickly say up front that obviously I'm going to spend only a few minutes here, but I'm going to talk about the technology piece of this for control tower. And Bryan did touch on this, but I think it bears repeating that clearly control tower is more than just the technology that enables it. It really is about companies first wanting to break down silos and realizing they have to act as one organism, I guess, which is where organization came from in the first place, or else they're not going to be able to achieve this. And the other thing is, in a lot of respects, you're only as good as the operational data you're generating in the first place. Otherwise, you're not generating the transactions at the point of the customer and capturing that at the level you need to in order to summarize that and bring all that information together to make better decisions. But with that, let me focus on the part that we provide. Again, at Kinaxis, I just wanted to open with the first slide here to say that these are the kind of customers that are our customers. So fortunately or unfortunately, it's mostly big brand name companies. So these are big problems they're trying to solve across not only their whole enterprise, but also across their multi-enterprise and their partner network. So if you take a look at someone like a Cisco as an example, they don't make very much. They make virtually nothing themselves. So they completely rely on other people to make their products. So they need to have all those people and processes integrated as though it were a single company in order to be agile enough to respond to the market and continue to keep the competitive advantage they've enjoyed for years now. One thing we do like to say is that I just picked ASICs and Raytheon here because we say that we do everything from running shoes to rockets. I think it's important to point out that everything that Bryan spoke about really is cross-industry and cross-department. It's a pretty holistic problem. So that's not to say that the scheduling of manufacturing between a process and discrete manufacturer isn't different, or that companies that sell directly to consumers versus business to business don't have different specifics around the problems. But at the end of the day, what Bryan spoke about getting time out of the system is really, quite similar across companies of all different industries. And we cover, again, large enterprises, brand name companies across these kind of industries. So for companies that don't have control towers, just to take a bit of a technology view, this tends to be what our customers look like before they come to us. I think and this you could see happened, I guess, in the supply chain management is 30 years old. So if you look back to, say, the mid-'80s kind of thing, people started with this idea of they looked for functional excellence. So either getting really good in a geography at, say, demand planning, or, another area getting really good with their supplier collaboration, or sales and operations planning, or optimizing their inventory, or whatever the case may be. But then as time went on, people said, we need to do more than functional excellence, because we're good at demand planning, if we can't line that up well with our suppliers, well, it's great that we understand our demand, but if we can't tightly couple that together with our supply to fulfill that demand, we're still not going to be a very agile company. So what they started to do after that was to lay on integration layers to try to tie all this stuff, all these different systems together. And now we're seeing more and more that companies spend more, in many cases, on integration software than they do actually on the different pieces of supply chain management software they have. And then, of course, this still doesn't give you the kind of agility to do the what-if analysis type stuff that Bryan's talking about. So what ends up happening on top of that is that Excel proliferation takes over all across companies, or maybe large enterprise data warehouse projects with business intelligence on top of that. And so I think people probably have seen this. And what we're saying is we really see this as a bit of a legacy approach. And the challenges with this really come down to three things at the highest level. The first is the best you can really hope for is functional excellence. So the best you could hope for would be to get really good at demand planning, as an example. The other thing, and the other two that are probably even more important, are you get a lot of decision latency because your data is spread out all over the place. So to combine that data together takes a long time to do if it's spread out. And then, of course, what you end up with is an incomplete global representation of the company that way. So what we like to talk about is a new paradigm that we call like global control tower for operations. Like Bryan said, the definition of that obviously continues to evolve. I don't think the important thing isn't so much what it's called, but what's more important is what people do, how they change their behavior, and then the business results that follow that. So it's still important, if you look at this, to be able to take data in, transactional type data from whether it be outsourced manufacturers, brand owners, suppliers, and customers that come from outside the organization, but to pull all that data together as well as the business rules around that data. So it's more than just data, but it's how that data interrelates to each other, and then pull all that together into a single control tower. And what you end up getting with that, and again, at Kinaxis, we only have one product that enables this, not a series of products. And what you get when you bring all those business rules and data together, if you layer the right set of capabilities on top of it, you end up with an end-to-end process enablement. So not functional excellence, but end-to-end across the organization and even outside the organization into the multi-enterprise value chain. Now you can get your global visibility and alignment, and then importantly, and what it all comes down to at the end of the day, is faster decisions, but also more accurate decisions that are taking into consideration your entire supply chain when you make them. So if we take a look at I've really just two slides as benefits to show you this, because we want to make sure we left lots of time for questions. This is an example, and Bryan spoke a lot about getting time out of the system. So what you see here, real customer examples of how long our customers took to do things in planning cycles previously with the legacy approach, if you will, and then after they implemented our product Rapid Response. So if you take a look here, even if I take the closest one of these together, what this was a company that reduced a large life sciences company that reduced their planning cycle from 21 days to 12. So if you think about that, by taking 9 days out of a planning cycle, or almost 50% out of a planning cycle, frees up a lot more time to get more nimble, to be able to execute quicker. It saves a lot on costs on the other end as well. So this saves on both sides of the equation of cost and revenue, because you're freeing up people to be more agile, and you're giving yourself a competitive advantage that your customers probably don't have. And on quicker decision making, it shows up even more. So it's important that you see this as collapsing both planning and execution. But from a planning perspective, it's one thing to get 9 days out. But if you think about the ability to respond as well to things like a change to a build plan, whether you can clear to build for a customer, and these type of things, just general order promising kind of things, where a big customer calls up and they want to know if you can fulfill an order. And typically, our customers will either have to guess, or because that data was spread out across very many systems, on average, it was taking people between 48 and about 56 hours to answer these kind of what seems like they should be basic questions. And with Rapid Response, most of them then get down into the minutes to be able to answer those, 30 minutes typically at a maximum. So that raises the question of what if you needed to answer your customer on any one of these things within 2 hours, and it takes you 48 hours to get an accurate answer? What you're going to do, and what companies do all the time, is they guess and just hope that the system can catch up, and that's where you end up seeing things like Bryan showed earlier, where your accuracy on delivery to customers is off by, say 11% from where it could be. It's not surprising really when you think about it, because what happens is your customer needs an answer quick, and you don't have a complete picture, so you have to guess. So this is really about taking guessing out of the system, and it drives up accuracy. And then a lot falls out of that, obviously, from all the way to cash cycles and inventory levels and so forth. We recently had our user conference and had one of our very large customers talk about how in 6 months they were able to actually finally reduce their inventory by 34% once they got this global control tower type view. So I didn't really want to spend any more time on it than that. I think the research speaks for itself, and I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time for you all to ask questions of either Bryan or myself. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joe, our moderator.
Hi, thanks so much, Kirk. And we did receive a good amount of questions from the audience, so I'll just pose them to the panel, and if you'd like to tag along, give an answer or tag on an answer to one of these questions as the other presenter, feel free. So the first question received here, what are the key pieces that companies are most often missing in achieving a control tower?
I'll take that one. I think from the responses that we get at sort of a generic sense, I think the tendency is that they are still in silos. I think it's the organizational side that's probably It's certainly the first challenge. The second challenge would be is once they decide that they want to view things end-to-end holistically, do they have the tools in place or the solutions in place to make that happen? Even if it gets them to call it the functional excellence standpoint, can they get that far? I mean, what pieces do they need to add, or do they need to sort of, go out and get something new that sits across the top? But I think the first thing is honestly that I think most companies struggle with are getting away from the silo and getting to the end-to-end view. That's what I would see going into it.
I'd back that up quickly. It first has to be the organizations be willing to break down the silos, and then having the data integrated into a single system to match that, so it also behaves. I think in the past it was that people's transactional systems were giving out a lot of bad data in the first place, but I think now through many years of ERP implementations, as an example, I think that part of the problem. I think most people have that part of their house in order now.
Great, thanks. Nice detailed question here, but I think I'll try to get to that if we have many time. This one's a little briefer. How do you see the technology enablers to control tower evolving? What types of technology are losing ground, and conversely, what types of technology capabilities are gaining?
I'll take the first stab. I think losing may not be exactly the right word, but they might be losing in comparison. Okay, I think anything that's sort of the transaction-based or system of record, as Kirk just mentioned, I believe most companies have or pretty much have that in place, at least certainly to some level. What we've seen is over 92% of manufacturers have an ERP system of some kind, so that's a data point. So I think that's in place, but conversely, so that's not where the new focus is in terms of things that they might be adding in terms of tools or systems or capabilities. So I would see that they could be lagging behind in terms comparatively, because those that are trying to move toward a control tower would be trying to be getting much more in terms of collaboration and visibility tools in place, connectivity tools, and then anything that might go along to support those in terms of collaboration with the customer, perhaps better information and analytics around that, or even with the suppliers, if you will, better just better tools, faster, and more integrated, if you will. So those would be the things that I think would be gaining, and conversely, that's what we see in our research. Those are where the priorities are in terms of what people are concentrating their technology spend are. I would add to that, tools that enable them to plan more quickly, run multiple scenarios. That's becoming a bigger thing, and also S&OP as a system or a plan of record. How do you do that and measure against that daily? That's becoming almost a requirement. It used to be a quarterly or monthly process, and now it's becoming a tool that you would use almost in real time. So,
I think Bryan pretty much nailed that. I think just the only way I would expand on it is that in some ways you think about it, what's losing are tools that are trying to just come up with a perfect answer, but in a siloed way. So again, clearly we have to continue to plan and forecast and try to get more accurate at that. But an academic exercise of having a system come up with a perfect number plan or forecast when it's not connected to the real supply, or like Bryan said, if you're not doing S&OP daily, so if you're saying, well, we could give up, if we actually gave up a little bit on trying to perfect our forecast, but instead looked at it every day, matched it on a daily basis against supply, except for like on just a longer term basis, you're actually going to ironically maybe get more accurate with that because it's more grounded in reality and more up to date. So instead of people obsessing with just systems of math, more getting into systems that combine math and heuristics with people so that people can collaborate and get closer to the customer, just to be a lot more nimble, if that makes sense. So kind of best of breed point solutions over integrative solutions that bring a lot of this together, so you get a more holistic view is where the switch really is. And the other one was not to spend too much time on, I think, because everyone knows about this anyway, and it's not related specifically to supply chain, but the move of people going to software in the cloud versus on premises. whether you call it software as a service or cloud, doesn't matter, but the hosted kind of software versus buying, installing is accelerating way quicker, I think, than anyone predicted, even though they predicted it to happen very quickly.
Great, thank you both. Next question here. From a process and technology standpoint, the control tower concept sounds great. Where I can see risks is the people side of the equation. This type of cross-functional collaboration that's been discussed is inherently hard to produce. It requires more than just connecting people and sharing information. How does that get addressed?
It's a good question. Probably not. There's not a one-word answer either. And I would go back to, we sort of said, I think I even mentioned it, it's a little bit of the chicken or the egg. If there's a belief that you need to move towards a control tower, then the obstacles fall down and the silos go away because people want that to happen. Now, they could be limited because of their tools, and therefore, they've got to go get those tools to enable them. The other side of it is if there's a belief but you just can't do the heavy lifting, that you need the tool to be able to enable it first, that could certainly be another, way to attack it, but there's got to be some belief. Again, a tool without using it correctly is not really effective. So on the people side, I think what it does say, though, as people have those capabilities or gain those capabilities, they've got to have probably a broader perspective. I would like to think that a lot of the supply chain people operate that way now. They think horizontally. And so, in their case, hopefully you're just enabling them. It's entirely possible, though, there's a limit, and you've got to sort of plan for that at the management level and say, gee, not only do we have to grow these people, but we've got to be communicating from the top down so they are very, very close to exactly what the priorities are. As Kirk mentioned, getting the plan right one time is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's maintaining the plan and keeping it out of the ditch day to day, minute to minute, month to month, that makes you successful or doesn't. It isn't about doing it once. It's about keeping it maintained and balanced as best you can. So doing that with the correct thought process in mind, what if the management decisions are at the appropriate levels, and what are the priorities? For example, I might say the customer service is the number one priority across the board, and 98% is okay. That's fine right up until I have to make sure that somebody never misses and they're 100%, and everyone has one of those customers probably. So even the rules, even if you tried to go out and sort of optimize it once, when you hit a certain point, the rules change, and then there's somewhat dynamic. Interpreting what those rules are and knowing what they are in real life or in real time, as you get to a control tower-like capability, you've got to have those embedded in your head in terms of what's the sequence I go through when I make those decisions. So a little bit of a long-winded answer, but very good question, and I think the people side are where the growth may need to happen next. So.
And just to add to that super quickly, because again, at the end of the day, I am a software guy, but I do think this is a people challenge, especially the way the question's asked, and it is a great question. And what I mean by that, I guess, is that it certainly requires a behavioral change, and I don't think I'm an idealist. Actually, I'm probably more, categorized as a cynic. But one thing where I am an idealist, which I think is important in this context, is I think to Brian's point that if people anywhere in the company know that the decision that they were making, had a better impact on customer service and company top or bottom line revenue, they would always take that choice. It's just that the tools that are provided today are usually so siloed that it's so disconnected from that it's no wonder that they end up stuck in their own silo. So I certainly think that it's a parallel path where you try to change behavior, whether it's through compensation systems or other reward systems on one side. But on the other side, I think if you give people a complete view, so they say, for instance, a sales rep or sales manager says, oh, if I had visibility to know that we have more supply of one product versus another, so I would, so that's the product that I talk more to, our customers about because we could deliver it to them quicker with a higher level of customer service. I think they're obviously going to do that. I just think that all through the company, people lack that complete view. So so for that reason, they can't even think in a non-sought-out way. So I think it will happen. Also, a long-winded answer, but I think the two things have to go in place: is the enabling technology to let people think more horizontally, across the enterprise, and also systems and processes and reward systems and everything that make people want to do it as well. But again, I think they're naturally going to want to do it anyway once they're able to see it.
Great, thanks. Next question here. Forgive me if I've read it. I'll just move on. Often when you talk about near real-time information decision-making, it's thought of solely in the context of short-term and front-line decisions. How does the control tower concept apply outside of the current S&OP cycle to more of an overall strategic planning and supply chain system perspective?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. I think there's no question that I think the majority of the decisions or the views are going to be somewhat within the S&OP cycle, but where I think the control tower concept could certainly help is certainly in the what-if scenario planning, and the fact that it would span ideally across the network of the supply chain, not just across the four walls. So you would test the limits in terms of maybe supply and capacity, outside the four walls. The other thing I think it brings into play, Kirk mentioned Cisco, and we actually had them at one of our summits, and I think there was a vice president of resiliency, I think his title was, and that's all he worried about was the risk mitigation side. And what they did, in the case of the tsunami, and bringing in all those what-if planning and risk scenarios into the fold as part of S&OP, I think is a pretty rich capability that companies could grow. But I would see it moving in that direction in terms of the scenario side. That's what comes to mind. And then when you test the limits of anything, it may help you drill down and say, gee, this is the next weakest link. So I think it can help you also on the capacity side or alternate supplier side, if you would.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the important thing is that it's not really about real-time information as much as it is about right-time information. So for some events, it's obviously real-time, and others it's not. I think the important thing is that you still have to plan on a fairly long horizon. Strategically, we have to know as a company that where we want to be in 5 or 10 years, or whatever kind of horizon we feel that we can handle. But usually those decisions are made today without we make decisions for what we think the world's going to look like for 5 or 10 years without spending a lot of time looking at what we look like today. I think it's important to be able to collapse those cycles to take information from any time period and use it to influence the other. So, for example, if we were in a project-based business and say, we want to in 5 years from now, create, do twice as many projects as we have of a certain type. Well, we better know what skills we have today, what kind of projects we're doing today. Are they really more profitable? All those kind of things. And usually those kind of things are guessed in Excel when you look at 5 or 10 years or other tools like that. But to actually take what's the reality of today so you can close the gap and make way better decisions in the long term is important. So I think the data of today is really important for long-term decisions as well. So I think you do need right-time, almost real-time information, even to make long-term decisions, which don't become less important in the control tower world. I don't think anyone wants to get to the point where all we're doing is reacting to situations.
Okay, thank you both. That was wonderful. This does bring us to the conclusion of our webinar. For any of those that wrote questions that did not get responded to, we will have our analysts reach out, or our Kirk will reach out and make sure your answer is received, or submitted, excuse me. Just a reminder again that a copy of the slides will be emailed to all the attendees. And I'd like to take this time now to thank our presenters, Bryan Ball and Kirk Munroe, for their research, their insights, and recommendations. I'd also like to thank our participants for their interest and their participation. And, of course, our sponsor for Kinaxis for making the webinar possible. I do hope you found it beneficial, and we wish you the best wherever you may be.